New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we will be revisiting the Stargate program. Stargate is one of the many acronyms that was used by the government as a reference to a 20-year effort through the various military, industrial, and military intelligence organizations devoted to looking at the application of clairvoyance, or what has come to be known as remote viewing, for purposes of intelligence gathering and espionage. My guest, Dr. Edwin C. May, was the scientific director of this program during its final decade of existence. He is co-author of several books, including ESP Wars, East and West, and an anthology that he co-edited called Anomalous Cognition, Scientific Papers About Remote Viewing. And most recently, he is the co-author of the first 2 volumes of the Stargate Archives. These are carefully edited government documents that were formally classified about this then secret program. The interview is conducted on Skype, and so I'm going to switch over now to the Skype channel. Welcome, Ed. It's a pleasure to be with you again. It's been, I think, a couple of years since we've been in the studio together, and this is an opportunity for us to revisit the whole multi-year and involvement that you have had with the program that is now known as Stargate, but I gather it actually had many different names over the course of its lifetime.
Yeah, that's true, Jeffrey, and thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed those sessions we did before when you were in Las Vegas. Too bad you didn't invite me all the way to Albuquerque, one of my favorite places to be.
Well, no, you're welcome here anytime, and I would love to have you back in the studio live with me, but until then, I'm glad we can communicate via Skype.
I do have one comment. It's sort of an amusing comment about the various special names other than Stargate. Mm-hmm. One of them was called Quantum Leap. I walked out of the Pentagon with a Marine Army colonel who said, "Ed, I've got good news. The new nickname for your program is called Quantum Leap." And I said, "Oh, gee, do we have to?" He said, "What's wrong?" I said, "A quantum leap progress is the smallest possible progress above none. Can we change it?" And we did.
Yeah. But in a way, many people would like to think that extrasensory perception, remote viewing, is just a tiny, insignificant thing if it exists at all.
Well, many people think that, and if one goes on and looks at YouTube and reads a lot of popular books, I myself would come away with that same feeling. If you look at the actual data, something's different. Yeah. Can I run an evidential question for you?
Sure.
So, all right. Suppose you decide to open up a brand new restaurant in Albuquerque. It's small, but it's beautiful. It only holds 19 people. On an opening night, 19 people show up. And for the next 3 weeks, 17 of those original 19 people are coming back for more at the same restaurant. What would you say about the quality of your restaurant?
I would say it must be high because people keep coming back.
Great statement. How much do I owe you for that statement? However, okay, hold that thought. Over the years, from 73 to 95, the various military agencies and intelligence agencies gave a mission for the people at SRI and later at Fort Meade, Maryland, where the psychic spying unit used to be. They tasked us with 504 separate missions. And those were spread out over 19 different federal agencies: the Army, the Navy, Secret Service, Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA, and so on. Okay? Mm-hmm. Of those 19 agencies, 17 of them came back with additional missions, including the CIA. They came back 43 times. Mm-hmm. And the all-time winner is something called the Joint Task Force, which is based out of Alameda here in California. One of their jobs is drug interdiction. Mm. They came back 172 times. So don't tell me ESP is small and it doesn't exist and it's not useful.
Well, when did you first join the program?
Late in 1975 as a very small part-time consultant. And I stayed that way until 79, where I became a senior research physicist on the staff. Mm-hmm.
And then, if I recall, it was about 1985 when you became the research director.
That's true, for the next 10 years.
Mm-hmm. So your involvement has been as a researcher, not as a percipient particularly, or as a military intelligence guy.
No. In fact, it's interesting to note, in these volumes for the Stargate archives, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, the introductions are extensive, describing how everything began and who started what. Those have been vetted by both my colleagues Puthoff and Targ, and they thought that it is an accurate representation of what went on. Mm-hmm. And what I found interesting is that our approach was different than most other laboratories, and we had a great advantage. That is, a lot of money, at least when compared to other research laboratories, because under my watch, if I didn't know how to make psychophysiology measurements, I'd hire somebody who was the best in the country for that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And that gave us a slight edge.
As I recall, the program brought in roughly $1 million a year for 20 years.
Yeah, that sounds better than it actually was, because it was lots of, I had a program for $2 million a year for 5 years, and there were lots of years where we had, the management was measuring the drapes to see who was going to take the next position, because it was huge variance in the money.
And I suppose one of the reasons that there were many different names and labels is because money came from different government agencies at different times.
Well, I'll ask a question. How much money, percent-wise, do you think the CIA gave us?
A percentage of the money you
received?
Total. I would say, well, based on popular accounts, it's probably over 50%, but in actuality, I'm going to say 10%.
It's actually 1%.
Uh-huh.
They gave us $195,000. Gave Puthoff and Targ $195,000, and that's 1% of $20 million.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, so obviously there were other government agencies also involved. How many different government agencies relied on your services?
19.
19 different agencies. So you were like well, wait, before I say you, because you operated initially out of SRI International, a big, think of it as a military industrial think tank.
Exactly.
And at some point you left SRI International and switched over to a company, a private enterprise known as SAIC.
Correct. But keep in mind, SRI International also is a private nonprofit organization.
But SAIC, I think, was a for-profit, is it not?
No, it turned that way, but when I was there, it was nonprofit also.
And that stands for Science Applications International Corporation.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. It's very much SRI-like, in both are defense contractors. However, SRI and SAIC both have lots of other jobs besides defense.
Mm-hmm. but they were highly respected as places where people could come for leading edge sorts of research.
Still do, actually.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about how your initial involvement with the program. As I recall, you explained to me at one time when we were together a few years ago that Ingo Swann brought you in.
That he did. As you know, Jeff, I spent a fair amount of time in India over the years, and after I was there for an entire year, I wrote Chuck Honerton a letter. He was the well-known parapsychologist in New York at that time, and said, "Hey, I'd like to come. I'm being in India. I'm about ready to go home." Wrote him this 10-page letter before email, and said, how about if I do this, this, this? He wrote me back a one-word letter. And that answer was yes. So I showed up in New York and started working for 8 months at Maimonides Medical Center. And in that process, I did meet Ingo. And we actually published some PK random number generator experiments that I did with Ingo there. And while Ingo couldn't tell me exactly what was going on, he said, how would you like to come and work at SRI? And I said, what's SRI? I've never heard of SRI. Mm-hmm. And he said, let me see what I can do.
But Ingo at that point was already well established with the Puthoff and Targ at SRI.
That's correct. And I think, Ingo, how to word this nicely, I wrote an obituary for him when Ingo passed away. And he told me once while we were sitting at dinner, he said, Ed, you don't want to be my friend. I said, why not, Ingo? He says, I could be a bitch on wheels. And in the obituary, I said, that was an understatement. And probably, I don't know if Hal would agree with this. I think he browbeat Hal into hiring me because Hal didn't know me either.
Yeah.
And what I brought to the table and what Ingo wanted me there for, Hal is a brilliant engineer, an electrical engineer, and much more capable in theory than I am. Mm-hmm. And Russ is a physicist, and a laser physicist, quite accomplished in both. But my area of expertise was hard-nosed nuclear physics research, experimental work. Mm-hmm. So they were doing a magnetometer experiment at that time and some other technical details. And this is almost an exact quote of Ingo. He said, Ed, I don't want somebody to devalue my PK because somebody flipped a light switch down the hall. Mm-hmm. And that was my job. And unfortunately, within the first month, I completely killed the magnetometer experiment. I went out and bought a dime store bar magnet about this big around, about that long, and I walked up and down in front of the hall, in the hall outside the lab where the magnetometer was, and just flipped the magnet like this. It drove the instrument crazy.
Now, the magnetometer, as I recall, was supposed to be shielded from that sort of thing.
It was supposed to be, yeah.
Uh-huh. But you discovered that it was not.
Totally not.
My goodness, and it was probably a very expensive magnetometer.
It may have been borrowed. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, so because this is a well-known experiment with Ingo Swann, that he was able to perturb a magnetometer that I thought was buried underground and shielded and...
That's a different magnetometer. That one was over at Stanford and was very well protected. Uh-huh. But this was a Navy-funded other magnetometer that was in the third floor of the building at SRI.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that got clarified.
Right.
Well, let me ask you another question, though, about your relationship with Ingo. But you and Ingo were both Scientologists, as I recall.
Not initially. Before I joined SRI, Ingo said, well, everything I learned about how to be psychic, I learned in Scientology. Mm-hmm. And I had never heard of Scientology. So I said to myself, hey, if I'm going to get serious about this, I better look into it.
Yeah.
And he introduced me to the Church of Scientology in L.A., and for a bunch of years, I found it was part of the human potential movement of that era. Mm-hmm. I found it extremely useful. And then I discovered they were bull goose, loony, and nuts. Quit.
Well, for what it's worth, Hal Puthoff was also a Scientologist, and Pat Price, who worked in the program in early years, was a Scientologist. So I suppose Russell was not.
Russell was not.
I think it's fair to say that there's, something about Scientology that, minimally speaking, one could say people who go through Scientology are open-minded about the possibilities of remote viewing.
When you apply for security clearances, the FBI does background investigations and all that.
Yeah.
I had applied for a particular clearance, and normally it took 8, 9 months to get it. 18 months had passed, and I did not know what the hell was going on. And I eventually found out what happened. It turned out Pat Price, and I think this may be in Russell Targ's film, Pat Price, when he worked directly for the CIA, was handing classified documents to the Church of Scientology.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1979, when the FBI raided the appropriate place in L.A. and found all these documents, it caused enormous problems, as you can well imagine.
Sure.
So then now the FBI guys are interviewing me, and they said, well, what about your Church of Scientology? We want to know. And I always like to push back with these characters. I said, wait a minute. The International Organization for Religion values the Church of Scientology as equal religion to everybody else's. So are you questioning my First Amendment rights to practice my religion unfettered?
Yeah.
While these two FBI goons do a full-bore backpedal. And I said, okay, now that we've cleared that up, I waive those rights. What do you want to know?
Well, obviously the government had a real interest in Scientology at that time. That's why they were raided.
I think their interest was financial.
Yeah, tax evasion.
People were, to do things at the Church of Scientology was frightfully expensive.
Yeah.
And everybody was writing those off as a donation to a church. And that grumped the Internal Revenue Service. That was the main Rosendetter for it.
I see. Oh, okay. Well, at some point, I guess around 1985, Hal Puthoff left and you became the research director. Russell Targ had left several years even before that.
82.
Mm-hmm. So the whole program sort of fell into your lap, and as I recall, rather suddenly and unexpectedly.
Yeah. And I managed with Puthoff started the game, but I closed the deal with a $10 million 5-year contract with the Army Medical Research and Development Command.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about that, the commander was a 2-star General Garrison Ratman. And unlike any other funding our program had over the years, he didn't get his money given to him through Congress to give to us. Instead, he had a certain budget that the Congress said, here, the medical command needs this amount of money. He took some of that money away from his own programs to give us a $10 million contract.
And which is obviously the largest single contract at the time.
Well, if it had all been realized, yes. Over the years, the largest supporter overall was Defense Intelligence Agency. The Med Command gave us realized $6 million.
Out of the initial 10 that had been implied by the contract.
Right.
I see. Well, let's talk about this question. When you took over the program or the research aspects of the program, at that point the applied aspects, military intelligence tasking was mostly done, I believe, through the program at Fort Meade in Maryland.
That was true after about 1979 onwards.
Mm-hmm.
We still did some, and we actually did some even after 1985.
Mm-hmm.
But the vast majority was shifted over to the in-house program at Fort Meade. But they didn't start until basically late 78, 79 timeframe.
Mm-hmm. Which is already 6 years before you became the research director.
Exactly.
What were the changes that you made when you took over the program?
Good question, Jeff. I think the primary thing was we were so well funded, and for the first time, I think ever, we had a basic research charter. Mm-hmm. We've always been able to do research, but it was oriented for 2 ways. One, if the intelligence community had found that something interesting was going on in Psi in Russia or China or somewhere else, they asked us to determine if that were true, is it a threat to the U.S.?
Mm.
We called that threat assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And so we could do a little bit of research to see whether this thing worked or it didn't, and so on. But most of the research was in that era was to find out how to make protocols better, how to analyze the data, how to get some prediction going. So when I say that the Russians are going to attack Beijing or something like that, I could give some, from a remote viewing point of view, give some evidence for that and why I believe the evidence. We didn't do a good job of that, actually. But that's what we called application-oriented research. And part of that was to do countermeasures and things of that nature. The big change was in 85, was a research charter to figure out how the world does ESP work.
Mm-hmm. And that was your focus. And as I recall, from previous conversations we've had, one of your big interests was establishing a high-level committee of scientists who would be looking over your shoulder, evaluating your methodologies, and providing feedback.
Yes. The medical command, first of all, we had three committees. One was called an IRB, which means Human Use Committee, and we had to formulate our own. And those people are there to protect the human use aspects when we're doing remote viewing experiments or things like that. Is it a danger or risk to them? But the most important committee was what we call the Scientific Oversight Committee, and the initial one had 12 members of the who's who in U.S. science from every discipline you can think of, philosophy and physics and psychology and so on. Some of those people were well known, like Phil Zimbardo was on our oversight committee. He's a well-known psychologist.
Yes.
We had, and all those people are named in the Stargate volumes. Stephen Hilliard, who's a very well-known neuroscientist, is still, I think he's professor emeritus now. These people were the entrance requirement that they had to be skeptical, but they had to be open-minded skeptical. And it was not a dash in, do something, and leave. They were with us for 5 years. And their job was threefold. Number one, to review our protocols and approve them before we actually did any studies at all. Now, we're pretty good at that. So the round robin, we'd send it to them. They'd criticize and send it back. That was very rapid. The other thing that they were allowed to do, and actually never did do it, and that is exercise drop-in privileges where there was with no warning to watch. They never did that. But the most important part was the review of all of our final reports. They had to review them as if they were submissions to their favorite technical journal and write it up. And in Volume 2, all of their comments are in our Volume 2. Now, the good news is we're good at what we do. We argued with them. They'd come to SRI for a 2-day meeting, and we'd win 85% of the arguments we'd get into. I mean, really roll up our sleeves and get at it. The better news was the 15% we lost because we learned to do it much better than we would have otherwise done. And from my academic aspect career, that was the highlight of my career, dealing with those people. At the end of the day, I would say all of them, without exception, said that we did the best possible science one could do. But about only 50% of them were, in fact, convinced that there was something worth looking at.
Oh, so in other words, 50% of these same people thought that you had nothing at all, in spite of the fact that the government agencies kept coming back for more.
But they didn't know that. They were only looking at the research side. One sort of personal story there. A close friend of mine, we'd been friends for years, a fellow physicist, a high-energy guy, won the Nobel Prize. With Leon Lederman to co-discovery of the muon neutrino. Longtime friend. His name is Mel Schwartz. And so I invited him down for dinner when he found the prize, and we were having a nice dinner. I said, "Hey, Mel, how'd you like to be on our scientific oversight committee?" He says, I think what you're doing is all BS. So what do you want me? And I said, well, really, Mel, your Nobel Prize looks good on the masthead. And he said, I said, the real reason I want you there is because you're an honest scientist, and I respect the way you think. He says, what if I'm watching you for a year and I still think it's all silly? And I said, if you can convince the other members of the committee of that, then I'll quit what I'm doing right now and come to work for you at Brookhaven National Laboratory. He says, done. I said, not even close to done. Mel, it's not even close. What if, after watching us for a year and talking with other members of the committee, you are convinced something's worthy of study? Mm-hmm. And he said, he thought about it. He says, if that's true, I'll help you try to figure out how it works for some fraction of the rest of my career. Mm. And he did just that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's impressive.
Very impressive.
But I'm not aware of any publications that have his name on them.
Nope. Everything was all classified then. His name's all over the review stuff in Volume 2. You'll see him there.
Okay. Well, I guess I have to. The price is pretty high. I have to warn our viewers. It's like $95 at this point for a brand new copy. So they're likely to be found primarily in libraries. It's not, these volumes aren't really intended, I suppose, for the average general reader, because most people won't shell out $95 for a book.
And I think probably the most exciting book that might even be worth the $95 is Volume 4. Volume 4 is coming out. It is a series of the U.S. government talked a lot among themselves at very high levels about our program. You know, our program had not much money at all in terms of government funding, but boy, did it have attention. All the way to the White House, the Vice President's office, agency directors, and so on. And all of them are briefed. And what we're able to show in Volume 4, who was briefed by whom and what they talked about and whether they supported. That includes senators and all this stuff. All that is in there from 73 all the way down to 95. And what we have is a synopsis that is about a 35,000-word synopsis as you just read the narrative of what happened over those years, and it points to where the supporting documents are in the paper. That itself is really worth the read.
And when will that Volume 4 be released?
Good question. All the manuscripts have been with McFarland publishers for over years now. The next one's going to be released is on PK. That was our first one 2 years ago.
I see.
So who knows?
So maybe sometime in 2019.
I think it's likely it'll be that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So we've had previous discussions about some of your findings, and in particular, your interest in entropy, your interest in precognition. Now it's been 2 years since we've really discussed those things. And looking back on the program at this point, have your theoretical ideas changed in any way since we last spoke?
Yes, they've hardened.
Uh-huh.
It's pretty clear. My colleague Sonali, who's going to be on your show, I think.
Yes.
We've co-authored papers where she's been the primary author, giving fairly compelling, at least I find them so, arguments of why there's only one form of informational psi. I mean, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, other forms of psi like that. And we can collapse them all down into just precognition. Mm-hmm. That may not be true, but one thing that's interesting about it is it reduces a whole lot of impossible problems only down to one impossible problem.
And it's a hypothesis worth exploring.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
Mm-hmm. So you're still very big on precognition, and you mentioned that your very first research in the program with Ingo was on psychokinesis.
Yeah, in fact, I joined the program as Mr. PK Man, not your Mr. PK.
Well, I'm the author of a book called The PK Man. I'm not the PK Man.
I'm not the guy.
But
the first experiment I was ever exposed to in Psi, I think I told this story before, was with John Youngerman, who was my boss at the cyclotron laboratory at the University of California at Davis.
Yes.
And he built a pendulum swinging back and forth and arranged it so it took about one heartbeat to go chunk, 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 just like a heartbeat.
Yeah.
And on the pendulum bob, there was a mirror. And by using very clever laser interferometry, we could tell the position of where that mirror was to 1/4 of a wavelength of light, really accurately.
Uh-huh.
And so what we want to know is what John Youngerman wanted to know, and I'm thinking, this is BS, I've never heard of this, is stupid, what a waste of time. People are going to try to focus their attention on that gadget and try to make the pendulum stutter someplace or not follow it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we ended up spending a fair amount of the cyclotron money to build the most expensive Interstate 80 truck detector in history. It was a great seismometer. Which the serious part of that, and what I brought to the table at SRI, we have a problem. I mean, you asked me what I've learned from this. One is this, that in our field, we have two kinds of definitions of all of our phenomena. One is negative. PK is what happens when nothing else did or could have happened. Mm-hmm. That's very, 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 very expensive to assure yourself of that. Yeah. Secondly, the other one is a operational definition, mainly in ESP worlds. If you do this ritual, whatever it is, what comes out of that ritual, we will just label ESP. It doesn't tell you anything at all about ESP or PK.
Right.
Now, this makes it really challenging, and one of the that you'll see in Volume 3 when it comes out, we spent about $500,000 with somebody I think you know, Julian Isaacs, with a strain gauge experiment. And most of that money was spent on engineering details. And what we found out in the pilot study, that this gadget in one building at SRI was sensitive to the elevator going up and down in another building at SRI.
Oh, my.
So
a strain gauge.
Yeah, it could tell when the building was shaking slightly.
I see.
The other thing that I learned from that, which is really interesting and why we spent so much money on it, is that we went to the electric company here, PG&E, and said, okay, would you please tell us how smooth your electric current is in the wall? And I said, well, we can't tell you that. And I said, oh, well, so we came down on their heads really heavy with classified stuff and said, you got to tell us, we won't tell anybody. But now we can. It's a public document. The probability, I'm sort of remembering this, it's conceptually true, don't hold me to the exact numbers, that the probability of getting a pulse that lasts for 1/1,000,000th of a second, a microsecond, 50 kilovolts tall, the probability of that occurring in any 10-minute period is unity.
50 kilovolts, that's 50,000 volts.
But it only lasts for a millionth of a second.
Okay. So what you're saying is it's happening all the time.
That's happening all the time. And those things won't affect your hi-fi set. It won't affect your massively accurate electric clock because it comes and goes so fast. But it radiates out from the wall. If you have a sensitive apparatus like we were building, we could see that. And, hey, that's something that's perturbing our system. And if somebody is trying PK, zaps it just at an unfortunate time when one of those pulses are, how do you know what was going on?
Right.
So what we had to do was move our apparatus to the center of a room to limit that, run everything by battery, of course. And then eventually we had to levitate the entire apparatus off an air table. So when the experiment was running, it wasn't sitting on anything. It was levitating in the air. And if you came by and just knocked on the door, we could tell exactly how hard you knocked and when it happened and what direction it was. And all that costs a lot of money. And eventually, I told our clients, please don't ask me to do any more PK experiments. They're too expensive, only because of a definitional problem.
In other words, if you have an apparatus designed to detect PK, it's impossible to shield that apparatus from other sorts of contamination.
Well, the problem is a statistical one, and what you said is true. That is, you cannot prove the negative. You cannot prove the null hypothesis. I cannot say to you, Jeffrey, I've proved that PK doesn't exist. All I can say to you is, when we do these experiments, we have yet to see any evidence that cannot be explained by, quote, normal means.
So at this point in time, it sounds as if you're not in the least bit convinced that there is such a thing as psychokinesis.
Can I caveat a little bit so my friends don't kill me?
Yeah, sure.
Actually, you can argue with Sonali about this. We fight about it all the time.
Yeah.
David Eagleman, a well-known neuroscientist, invented a classic term called possibilian. He said, we don't know, if we don't know something now, maybe it will be possible a little years from now or tomorrow. And in that regard, I define myself as a possibilian for macro PK. Why? I think you and I have talked about this. The poltergeist literature, some of it is just overwhelming.
Yeah.
I don't know what that's going on. Maybe there'll be natural explanations for it because of the definitional problem, but I can't turn a blind eye to that. Mm-hmm. Laboratory PK, I can. No one's done a good experiment yet that convinces me.
Mm-hmm. For this reason of possible artifacts.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Most people who do it are well-meaning. Mm-hmm. They just don't know. You don't want to have it within a yard of or a meter to the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then ESP comes in there. ESP comes in. Well, I'll only focus when I know by ESP reasons the wall's going to shake. Earthquake's coming.
Yeah. So I gather then what you're saying is that the government program really, at least during your involvement, didn't particularly focus on psychokinesis.
No, that's true. We did some work with an alpha particle experiment, shoot a beam of alpha particles and see if you could deflect it. Mm-hmm. And we brought Jessica Utz, a statistician, in on that job because here's the problem. The alpha particles were coming like this and banging into a detector, and a PK person was supposed to deflect them up or down. Mm-hmm. And you can never have a pure vacuum, even though we had very, very high vacuum. So an alpha particle might bang into a residual molecule that's in there, get deflected.
Yeah.
So we would know the probability at that would be as they were higher and higher away from the center. Mm-hmm. So you could pick something and say, well, the chances of an alpha particle hitting that is 10 to the minus 15th. That means it's really close to zero.
Yeah.
Okay, what happens if you get one particle in there? What do you determine?
I know on one occasion I was with Charles Muzez, who was a mathematician interested in these things, and he said, suppose an event is so rare it occurs only once in the history of the universe, but that once is right now.
Yeah, right, there you are. I like that.
Yeah. You have a lot of healthy skepticism that you've applied to your research, and you've managed to do it in a way in which you've developed friendly conversations with other scientists who are also skeptical but open-minded.
Yeah. I'm negotiating with, and he'll remain nameless for a while, a well-known public skeptic who's going to review Volume 2 for us.
Uh-huh.
So stay tuned.
Okay, and
actually, I can say in this book, I think we talked a lot about it when we were together.
Yes,
40% by page numbers are invited skeptics for this book. Mm-hmm. One of those is a guy named E.J. Wagenmaker, who was one of the chief skeptics on Daryl Bem's experiments.
Oh, yes, I recall his criticisms. He's a statistician who takes a Bayesian point of view. Yeah.
Well, we got along just really fine. And I said, you can't use this invitation to write a chapter to beat up on Daryl Bem. It's got to be broader than that.
Yeah.
So the end story was, and I caught him off guard because he ended up publishing 11 items that parapsychologists have to fulfill before he finds it interesting. Mm. And the way I responded to that, with a pleasant conversation, I said, well, EJ, we've got 15, including your 11. That shut him up.
I see. Well, but did you publish that, or did you decide to rewrite it?
It's in this book.
It is. Okay.
Well, the sad part about this is, if all I knew about Psi was I see in the popular media and some of our well-known, intentioned colleagues,
yeah.
Frankly, it's crap. And I would be just as skeptical as anybody of these guys. They're skeptical when and only when they don't know what the real data are. Mm-hmm. If you sit down with them and don't try to convince them their worldview is wrong, it's non-local consciousness or angels dancing on the head of a pin or whatever, if you approach them that way, no wonder they're not going to pay any attention to you. Mm-hmm. There's a way to do that that's not terribly self-effacing. It's confident, but you have to listen to what they have to say and say, well, why are you so skeptical? And I've learned from that. This one skeptic I'm courting, I said, I like skepticism better than I like my crazy buddies who are believers on everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that caught his attention.
Well, now that would put you, I suppose, a little bit outside the mainstream of parapsychologists.
Sadly, yes.
Uh-huh. I mean, in general, parapsychologists do want to hear skeptical criticisms to a point, because I think there's an emotional issue here, and sometimes parapsychologists feel that skeptics are being unfair.
I don't think so, actually. Some are. I mean, in there's that bell-shaped curve. There are some believers who are more than unfair about what they believe in.
Yeah. Well, let me jump around a little bit, because we could pursue this topic a long time, I'm sure, but I want to come back to psychokinesis and the fact that you made a determination at some point that it wasn't a very good way to spend research dollars.
Because it was so expensive, yes.
Yeah. On the other hand, I'm under the impression, and you would know better than I, that the Russian research program, through their military intelligence, was much more interested in psychokinesis.
Yes. The guy that wrote the foreword for this book, his name is Nikolai Sham. He's a general. He was the first deputy of the KGB.
Yeah.
And I know him personally. We've spent a long time together.
You got to know him after the program's closed, I presume.
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
And he told me in a meeting, he said, we spent huge amounts of money at 40 different research institutes around the former Soviet Union to build psychotronic generators as weapons. He said we couldn't make any of them work. And I said, well, Sham, had you managed to get those to work, you guys would have won the Cold War and we had a good laugh over it. Yeah. But the serious part is I get yelled at by our colleagues, and you sometimes even, that I'm biased against PK, and if you're only more open to the phenomenon, it would work better. Are you kidding? We had a whole bunch of Soviet Army people that had nothing but wanted it to work so they could win the Cold War, and they couldn't make it work.
Well, but you were referring to specifically to psychotronic devices.
Well, that's PK, charging them up.
Yeah.
They would blast you. You're quibbling here with words. It wasn't remote viewing. Yeah. It was a device that aimed at you. It was non-lethal weaponry. It aimed at you would get a stomach ache in a critical negotiation.
Okay.
That's pretty psychokinetic, if you ask me.
Yeah. All right. Fair enough. Because, of course, there's the earlier work of Vasiliev with remote hypnotic induction and so on.
Yeah.
And I'm under the impression that it was always an interest over there in Russia.
Yeah, that's true. They believe very strongly in that. Even now, I know some people that are still looking at it. But that's one of those gray areas. You want to see a PK experiment? It's mind over matter?
There you go.
So between that and hypnotizing you at a distance, it's a definitional problem. But what these guys did in the military, that was not definitional. They wanted to build a gadget that would influence you at a distance and cause you problems.
Yeah. And
emphasis on the word cause.
And they claim, or you feel confident that when he told you none of them worked, that that's the truth. And
I believe it is.
Yeah.
He wrote some pretty kind words in here about that.
Oh, okay. So, would you say that the Russians have dropped all of their programs, or they're still involved?
Well, that's a question people ask about us for our program.
Yeah.
The guy that ran their remote viewing program for years is a fellow by the name of Alexei Yurovich Savin, an admiral, holds 2 PhDs, one in philosophy and one in mathematics. Very smart guy. At the height of his program, they had 120 remote viewers, and they were part of an organization that reported to, on our side, would be called the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Very high level of the military.
Yeah.
And I met one of their remote viewers, and Joe McMonagle did also, a woman named Elena Klimova, who was equally as good as Joe and had a condemnation award, not unlike the one that Joe has. What's the award that Joe has?
Legion of Merit, as I
Legion
recall.
of Merit Award.
Yeah.
And they did a joint remote viewing together, so I have firsthand knowledge of how good this woman is.
Mm-hmm.
Alex said that, like us, they had people who were trying to put them out of business from the time when they started.
Mm-hmm.
Same on our side.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a bunch of very serious protectors keeping the wolves out of our door.
Mm-hmm.
And that included Dale Graff, who was really good, but primarily William Cohen, when he was senator, stood in the way. Other senators, John Glenn, George Mitchell, other senators who protected what we did. In Volume 4, you will see how they protected us.
Okay.
So those guys have retired.
Yeah.
Jack Verona, for example, is pushing 90. He's not doing this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I think while there are... Joe McMonagle and I spent a decade trying to get something restarted. Oh, back up. Joe and I were in Moscow at a meeting with the Russian remote viewers and the general officers and the GRU people. And on the second day, when you refer to these people, you always use their first and middle name, like Alexei Yurovich, not General Savin, but not Alexei, just Alexei Yurovich, this Alexei. So I said something at the table, Alexei Yurovich, what about? And he stopped me, and in the 20 years I've known this man, it's the only time he's spoken to me in English. He said, Ed, we're friends, call me Alexei. And you could see his staff mouth go like that, because none of them can call him Alexei. Mm. And he then went back into Russian and told me, I know you're going to write an intelligence contact report to hand to your people at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I said, yes, sir, I will do that. He said, good. Take all the pictures you want. And by the way, here's my organization chart. And tell them that I want a joint program with you on counterterrorism. We have the same problem. Mm-hmm. I said, God, are you kidding? So I wrote about a 35-page paper like that. And, Jeff, I literally handed that to the 3-star in charge of Defense Intelligence Agency. And he said, oh, this is great. It's cheap. It doesn't put people in harm's way. This is an obvious thing to do, he told me. And I'm going to Moscow next week. I'll look up Savin and we'll see what we can do. Mm-hmm. Honest to God, I could practically hear him throwing it in the wastebasket by the time I closed the door behind me. Never happened.
Yeah. Well,
and that's why I'm convinced that we should be doing it, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think we are.
And I presume the original question, is anything still going on in Russia?
I don't think so.
Uh-huh.
For the same reason, actually.
Well, the reason here, I'm assuming, is actually I don't know the reason. My assumption would have been that maybe relations between the U.S. and Russia are beginning to chill again.
No, I don't think that. I mean, actually, between the Democrats and the Republicans, we got a lot more money out of the Republicans than we did out of the Democrats. So it's somewhat apolitical. As I began to tell you, that Joe and I spent a decade trying to get things restarted on counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. And what it amounts to is the working people, sort of middle-level people who are part of this group that came back, 89% of them came back for more. Those guys love this stuff. Even the folks at CIA love this stuff. Yeah. The problem is that they lose out at the management, both political appointee level and at the management level. Because they're afraid of ridicule.
Yeah. Well, that raises a huge question, which is, can a government organization with all the complexities of our politics and our bureaucracy and religious issues and scientific issues, is a government agency really capable of managing a parapsychology program, given all the controversies?
Absolutely. Managed ours beautifully for all those years.
Mm-hmm. But as you say, you had people who were protecting you because there were other people, unspecified, who wanted to kill that program.
That's true of every program that probably ever existed. There are people that I want to kill your air base in your state because I want it in my state. That's just politics.
Okay. Yeah. So what you're saying is the politics was no different than for any other program.
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, that's important because, you have people, for example, who want to kill everything associated with parapsychology because they believe it's demonic, including, I think,
That's
members
true.
of Congress. I don't
Absolutely.
think you get that so much with other programs.
That's probably true, yeah. I don't think anybody thinks a laser is demonic, but maybe.
It's possible.
That's true.
Well, great to talk to you, Ed. And now that we've established a really good audio-video connection, even before you visit Albuquerque again, I hope you'll be open to further conversations. Yeah.
Well, what I would like to say, Jeff, you always ask excellent questions. I very much appreciate what you do.
Well, good. So we'll stay in touch and do this on occasion in the future.
I would enjoy that, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.